The transport shuttle's landing thrusters kicked up a storm of red dust and regret as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell arrived at Forward Operating Base Titan 9, her new assignment courtesy of what her superiors diplomatically called interspecies cooperation initiatives, and what everyone else recognized as the military equivalent of being sent to manage a daycare center for heavily armed children from different planets. "Welcome to paradise," she muttered, shouldering her duffel bag and stepping onto the landing platform while cursing the bureaucratic genius who decided that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic defense was providing middle management for alien warrior cultures that had been perfecting the art of warfare since before humans discovered fire. The base spread out before her like a monument to optimistic military planning. Prefabricated structures designed for efficiency rather than comfort, defensive positions that looked impressive until you realized they were defending against threats that could probably ignore conventional fortifications, and the distinctive architecture of multiple species attempting to coexist in what amounted to a heavily fortified college dormitory. "Commander Mitchell, I presume?" The voice carried an accent that made Sarah's spine straighten with recognition and dread. She turned toward the command center entrance where a figure stood silhouetted against the artificial lighting, and every instinct she developed during 15 years of military service screamed warnings about the conversation she was about to endure. Captain Kira Thorne stepped into the light with the fluid grace of someone who'd been engineered for combat efficiency and had spent years perfecting the art of making everyone else feel inadequate by comparison. Her elongated ears, elegant and pointed like something from ancient Earth mythology, caught the base's security lighting as she approached with a smile that promised the kind of conversation Sarah would later want to forget. Well, Kira said, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species but sharpened into something that could cut through armor plating. "Sarah Mitchell. I heard they were sending someone to take command of our little multicultural experiment, but I never imagined they'd scrape the bottom of the personnel barrel quite this thoroughly." The command center's main briefing room had filled with troops from multiple species, all ostensibly busy with important military duties but clearly positioning themselves to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Sarah recognized the universal military phenomenon of soldiers developing supernatural hearing when their superiors were about to provide free entertainment. "Captain Thorne," Sarah replied with the practiced neutrality that had gotten her through academy politics and several diplomatic incidents involving beings who could literally tear her limb from limb. "I see you've managed to maintain your charming personality despite all these years of professional development." Kira's laugh rang through the briefing room like breaking crystal, beautiful and sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, Sarah. Still trying to match wits when you should be grateful they found you something to do that doesn't require actual tactical competence. Tell me, did they explain that this assignment is essentially babysitting duty for species too primitive to handle real military responsibility?" The assembled troops shifted uncomfortably, alien and human personnel alike recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended normal military hierarchy. Sarah felt the familiar weight of public humiliation settling around her shoulders like an old coat, but her mind was already cataloging the subtle changes in her former academy rival. Kira had always been competitive, always eager to prove her superiority in training exercises and academic challenges. But this cruelty was new, performed with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested practice. The Kira she remembered had been proud and occasionally arrogant, but never genuinely vicious. "I'm sure the assignment parameters will become clear during the operational briefings," Sarah said, maintaining her professional composure while mentally preparing for what promised to be the most challenging command of her career. Not because of enemy action or logistical nightmares, but because she'd apparently been placed in charge of a joint operation that included someone who seemed determined to make her life as miserable as possible. "Operational briefings," Kira repeated, her voice dripping with condescension as she addressed the room rather than Sarah directly. "Everyone, please prepare yourselves for tactical wisdom from someone whose greatest military achievement was graduating middle of her academy class and avoiding court-martial for incompetence through what I can only assume was exceptional paperwork skills." The laughter that followed came primarily from the alien troops under Kira's command, a sound that echoed through the briefing room and settled into Sarah's memory like a physical wound. But even as she endured the public humiliation, she noticed something in Kira's eyes that didn't match the cruelty of her words, a flicker of something that might have been pain, quickly hidden behind the mask of professional disdain. Now then, Kira continued, her performance reaching its crescendo, shall we review the tactical situation, or would you prefer to start with basic concepts like which end of a plasma rifle produces the dangerous energy discharge? I want to make sure we're operating at an appropriate level for our new commanding officer's capabilities. 3 weeks into what Sarah had privately begun calling the most elaborate professional hazing in military history, Kira's campaign of public humiliation had evolved into something approaching performance art. Every briefing became a theater of calculated cruelty, every joint operation an opportunity to demonstrate human tactical inadequacy, and every casual interaction a chance to remind everyone within earshot that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell was, in Kira's expert opinion, barely qualified to organize a supply closet, let alone command a multicultural defense force. As you can see from these reconnaissance reports, Kira announced during the morning tactical briefing, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never met a strategic concept she couldn't master or a human officer she couldn't intellectually eviscerate, the enemy has established forward positions using tactics that require spatial reasoning capabilities beyond baseline human cognitive parameters. Sarah stood at the holographic display, maintaining her professional composure while Kira systematically dismantled her proposed assault plan in front of 37 military personnel from 6 different species. The alien troops under Kira's command followed their captain's lead, exchanging knowing glances and barely suppressed snickers that made the briefing room feel like an academy classroom where Sarah was perpetually the student everyone expected to fail. Perhaps Commander Mitchell could explain how her species intends to compensate for these inherent limitations. Kira continued, her tone suggesting genuine scientific curiosity about how primitive life forms attempted to participate in activities clearly beyond their evolutionary capabilities. Because from my analysis, this tactical approach demonstrates either remarkable optimism or complete disconnection from military reality. The plan accounts for human cognitive differences through integrated support systems and coordinated species-specific roles, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing heat in her cheeks. She'd spent years learning to function under pressure, but there was something uniquely devastating about being professionally dissected by someone who knew exactly which criticisms would hurt most. Kira's laugh could have shattered crystal and probably violated several acoustic warfare treaties. Integrated support systems. How diplomatically you phrase requiring constant supervision by competent personnel to prevent catastrophic failure. Tell me, Sarah, do your tactical manuals include sections on graceful surrender, or do you simply rely on more advanced species to extract you from situations your planning capabilities inevitably create? The assembled troops watched this exchange with the fascinated horror of beings witnessing a slow-motion collision between military protocols and personal vendettas. Sarah caught Lieutenant Rodriguez shooting sympathetic glances her way, while the alien personnel seemed divided between uncomfortable acknowledgement of their captain's tactical brilliance and growing unease with her increasingly personal attacks. Major Chen, Sarah's second-in-command, finally cleared his throat with the diplomatic courage of someone who'd spent 15 years learning when to intervene in situations that were spiraling beyond professional boundaries. Captain Thorne, perhaps we could focus on specific operational parameters rather than theoretical species capabilities. Of course, Major, Kira replied with a smile that could have been carved from ice and malice. Let's examine how Commander Mitchell's latest strategic masterpiece accounts for the fact that her proposed assault route passes through terrain that requires enhanced sensory capabilities, advanced reflexes, and spatial awareness that baseline humans simply do not possess. Unless, of course, she's planning to request evolutionary upgrades for her entire command staff. Sarah felt the familiar academy memories surfacing, late nights in the tactical simulation labs where Kira's competitive nature had pushed both of them to excel, study sessions that had evolved into arguments about strategic theory that sometimes lasted until dawn, and moments of unexpected camaraderie when their rivalry had briefly transformed into something that felt almost like friendship. But this wasn't the Kira she remembered from their academy days. That woman had been proud and occasionally arrogant, but her competitiveness had been born from a genuine desire to excel rather than a need to destroy others. This version of Kira seemed to take active pleasure in dismantling Sarah's confidence piece by piece, as if proving human inferiority had become a personal mission rather than a professional assessment. The tactical approach incorporates multi-species coordination protocols, Sarah said, pointing to specific elements of the holographic display while trying to ignore the way Kira's alien troops were already shaking their heads in dismissive anticipation of their captain's response. Multi-species coordination, Kira repeated, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. A euphemism for hoping that superior beings will compensate for human limitations through charitable intervention. How inspiring to witness such confidence in tactical approaches that essentially amount to sophisticated begging for assistance from competent military personnel. The briefing room fell into the kind of silence that preceded either violence or complete professional breakdown. Sarah stood at the display, surrounded by tactical data that suddenly felt like evidence of her own inadequacy, while Kira's performance reached its crescendo with the precision of a master conducting a symphony of systematic humiliation. Perhaps, Kira concluded, her voice softening into something almost resembling pity, we should consider simplifying the operational parameters to match the available command capabilities. After all, there's no shame in accepting assignments that match one's actual qualifications rather than one's optimistic self-assessment. But even as the words cut through Sarah's professional composure like plasma through armor, she caught something in Kira's expression that didn't match the cruelty of her performance, a flicker of what might have been regret, quickly hidden behind the mask of superior disdain that had become her trademark. The pre-mission briefing for Operation Starfall should have been a routine strategic overview, but in Kira's capable hands, it had transformed into what Sarah privately considered the most elaborately orchestrated character assassination in military history. The main assembly hall buzzed with nervous energy as troops from multiple species gathered to receive final orders for what everyone understood could be the decisive engagement of the sector conflict. Before we begin, Kira announced, her voice carrying easily across the packed assembly hall, I think we should all take a moment to appreciate the remarkable optimism demonstrated by Command in assigning this operation to our current leadership structure. Sarah stood at the central podium, surrounded by holographic displays showing enemy positions and tactical overlays that represented weeks of careful planning and coordination between multiple species' military doctrines. But she could already feel the familiar weight of impending humiliation settling around her shoulders as Kira positioned herself for another public performance. Commander Mitchell has prepared what I can only describe as an ambitious strategic plan, Kira continued, her tone suggesting the kind of gentle amusement reserved for children who'd attempted to build starships from kitchen utensils. One that demonstrates either remarkable faith in human tactical innovation or complete disconnection from the physical laws governing modern warfare. The assembled troops shifted uncomfortably, alien and human personnel alike recognizing that they were about to witness another episode in what had become the base's most uncomfortable ongoing entertainment. Sarah caught sympathetic glances from her human officers and expressions of growing unease from some of the alien warriors who seemed increasingly troubled by their captain's behavior. The operation calls for coordinated multi-vector assault utilizing combined species capabilities, Sarah began, activating the tactical display with hands that remained steady despite the anticipation of inevitable interruption. Coordinated multi-vector assault, Kira repeated, her laugh ringing through the assembly hall like breaking glass. How impressively technical that sounds. Tell me, everyone, does that translate to hoping that superior military personnel will compensate for human strategic limitations through charitable intervention in yet another doomed tactical concept? The laughter that followed came primarily from Kira's alien troops, but Sarah noticed that it sounded increasingly forced, as if they were performing loyalty rather than expressing genuine amusement. Several of the more experienced warriors looked distinctly uncomfortable with their captain's behavior. Perhaps Captain Thorne could allow the briefing to continue, Major Chen suggested with the diplomatic courage of someone who'd watched this pattern repeat itself too many times to remain silent. Of course, Major, Kira replied with mock courtesy. Please, Commander Mitchell, continue explaining how your species intends to overcome the minor obstacles of inferior reflexes, limited sensory capabilities, and tactical reasoning that appears to have evolved primarily for hunting small mammals rather than conducting interstellar warfare. Sarah felt something shift inside her as she looked out at the assembled troops, beings from multiple worlds who deserved better than to witness their commanding officers engaged in what amounted to professional sabotage disguised as tactical assessment. But more than that, she found herself studying Kira's performance with new eyes, recognizing subtle inconsistencies that suggested this cruelty wasn't as natural as it appeared. The enemy's defensive positions utilize quantum displacement fields that require precise timing coordination, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the genuine tactical challenges rather than Kira's interruptions. Quantum displacement fields, Kira said, her voice dripping with condescension. How fascinating that Commander Mitchell believes human reaction times are sufficient for operations requiring nanosecond precision. Tell me, Sarah, did your tactical training include courses in wishful thinking, or is this level of optimistic delusion something you developed independently? But this time, Sarah caught it, the way Kira's voice had cracked slightly on her name, the momentary hesitation before launching into the familiar pattern of mockery. The performance was beginning to show stress fractures, and Sarah suddenly realized that what she'd been interpreting as casual cruelty might be something far more complex and painful. The operation requires trust between species, Sarah said quietly, her words cutting through Kira's prepared ridicule. Trust that we can work together despite our differences, despite our fears, despite the walls we build around ourselves to avoid being hurt. The assembly hall fell silent, the sudden shift in tone catching everyone off guard. Kira's mouth opened to deliver another cutting remark, but something in Sarah's expression seemed to disarm her usual verbal weaponry. Trust, Kira repeated, but her voice lacked its usual edge. How remarkably naive, even for human tactical doctrine. Maybe, Sarah agreed, her eyes meeting Kira's across the crowded hall. But sometimes the most naive approaches reveal truths that sophisticated strategies miss entirely. For a moment, the carefully constructed facade of professional disdain wavered, and Sarah glimpsed something in Kira's expression that looked almost like vulnerability. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of superior contempt that had defined their interactions for weeks. How inspiring, Kira said, but her voice carried none of its usual venom. Shall we continue with this exercise in tactical optimism, or would you prefer to discuss the statistical probability of human survival in quantum displacement field environments? The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Sarah recognized it for what it really was, a desperate attempt to maintain emotional distance through familiar patterns of mockery. The realization hit her with startling clarity. Kira's cruelty wasn't born from contempt but from something far more complicated and infinitely more painful. The final confrontation erupted in the base's main assembly area with the devastating precision of a tactical strike, except the weapons were words and the casualties were years of carefully buried emotions. Kira had orchestrated her most elaborate performance yet, gathering troops from multiple species to witness what she clearly intended as the complete and public destruction of Sarah's authority. I think it's time we addressed the fundamental question that everyone has been too polite to ask, Kira announced, her voice carrying across the packed assembly hall with the authority of someone who'd never met a room she couldn't dominate. Namely, how long we're expected to pretend that this assignment represents anything other than charity work for a species that lacks the basic qualifications for modern military command. Sarah stood at the center of the assembly, surrounded by holographic displays showing the upcoming mission parameters, while Kira circled her like a predator who'd finally cornered wounded prey. The assembled troops watched with the fascinated horror of beings witnessing a collision between military protocol and personal vendetta. Commander Mitchell's tactical planning demonstrates the kind of optimistic thinking that might be charming in civilian academic settings, Kira continued, her cruel laughter echoing off the assembly hall's metal walls. Unfortunately, we're not conducting theoretical exercises here. We're preparing for actual combat against enemies who won't be impressed by human determination or inspirational speeches about cooperation. The alien troops under Kira's command provided dutiful laughter, but Sarah noticed that the sound had grown increasingly hollow over the weeks, as if they were performing loyalty rather than expressing genuine amusement. Several of the more experienced warriors looked openly uncomfortable with their captain's behavior. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that command made an error in assignment protocols, Kira suggested, her voice carrying mock concern. After all, there's no shame in acknowledging that some species are better suited for support roles rather than strategic leadership. Evolution doesn't distribute capabilities equally, and pretending otherwise serves no one's interests. Captain Thorne, Major Chim began, but Kira cut him off with a gesture that brooked no interruption. No, Major, I think it's time for honesty. Commander Mitchell's upcoming mission is essentially a suicide run disguised as tactical brilliance. Her planning ignores basic physical limitations, her strategic concepts violate fundamental principles of quantum warfare, and her leadership style appears to be based primarily on hoping that superior beings will compensate for human inadequacy through charitable intervention. The assembly hall had fallen into the kind of silence that preceded either violence or complete institutional breakdown. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her response, waiting to see whether she would finally crack under the sustained assault on her competence and dignity. But instead of anger or defensive justification, Sarah found herself looking at Kira with sudden clarity. The weeks of systematic humiliation crystallized into understanding as she recognized the performance for what it truly was, not contempt, but desperation. The cruelty wasn't born from superiority but from fear, from someone trying so hard to maintain emotional distance that she transformed herself into a weapon against her own feelings. Kira, Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the hostile atmosphere like a blade through armor. The use of her first name instead of rank seemed to catch the alien captain off guard, disrupting the familiar rhythm of professional mockery. Tell me, Commander Mitchell, Kira continued, but her voice carried less venom than usual, as if Sarah's tone had somehow disarmed her verbal weaponry. Do you have any final inspirational words for troops who are about to risk their lives based on tactical planning that violates basic principles of military science? Sarah stepped closer, ignoring the assembled crowd and focusing entirely on the woman who'd been systematically destroying her credibility for weeks. When she spoke, her words carried no anger, no professional defensiveness, no attempt at clever comeback or strategic counterattack. I missed you, she said simply. The effect was immediate and devastating. Kira's cruel laughter died mid-breath, her carefully constructed smile vanishing as if it had never existed. Her voice, when she tried to respond, came out as a broken whisper that carried none of its usual authority. What did you say? She managed, but the words cracked like ice under pressure. I missed you, Sarah repeated, her voice gentle but clearly audible across the stunned assembly hall. Every day since academy graduation. Every mission, every assignment, every promotion that took me further from the possibility of seeing you again. I missed your competitive spirit, your brilliant tactical mind, even your arrogance. I missed having someone who could challenge me to be better than I thought possible. Kira took a trembling step backward, her composure crumbling like a fortress under sustained bombardment. The unshakable warrior who had dominated every encounter through sheer force of personality suddenly looked lost, vulnerable in ways that seemed to terrify her more than any battlefield threat. You don't. She started, then stopped, her voice failing entirely as years of suppressed emotion threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. I know you missed me too, Sarah continued, her words carrying the quiet certainty of someone who'd finally understood a puzzle that had been tormenting her for weeks. All this cruelty, all this public humiliation, you're not trying to destroy me, Kira. You're trying to destroy the part of yourself that cares. But it's not working, is it? The assembly hall remained frozen in stunned silence as the most feared warrior in the sector stood trembling before a human officer whose only weapon was honesty. Kira's hands shook as she struggled to rebuild the walls that Sarah's simple admission had shattered, but the damage was too complete, the vulnerability too exposed. I can't, Kira whispered, her voice breaking on the admission. My people, the regulations, the cultural protocols, we're not supposed to feel. Then maybe it's time to stop following protocols that make you miserable, Sarah said gently, reaching out with one hand in a gesture of offering rather than demand. Maybe it's time to admit that missing someone isn't weakness, it's proof that connection transcends species, regulations, and all the barriers we build to protect ourselves from caring too much. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible divide, while two military officers from different worlds discovered that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't superior weapons or advanced tactics. It was the simple courage to admit that love could exist even in the space between sworn enemies.